Okay, I'm going to get started. So just to give you a quick outline of today's lecture, I'm going to introduce the everyday life in the Upper Paleolithic. I think it's important because often when we look at those history of art textbooks that James was talking about, and I think about all the courses that I took as an undergrad, we see the Paleolithic art, but often without the context, the social context in which the art was produced. So I want to talk about that first. Then I'm going to ask the question about what is Paleolithic art. Is it art? Because those are the questions that James asked me to address. Is it art? Is it associated with ritual? So I'm going to try and answer those, and again, talk about what we know and what we don't know, and then I'll conclude. So to begin with everyday life, so just again to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm sure a lot of you know this already, but the time period we're talking about is the Paleolithic, paleo meaning old and lithic meaning stone, so it's the old Stone Age. And we contrast this with, for example, the Neolithic, the new Stone Age, when we have the beginnings of agriculture. And so it's an archaeological term, and it's really based on the kinds of stone tools that people find during these periods. And I have an example of a beautiful hand axe here. So the time period really ranges all the way from 3.5 million years ago, when you have the first stone tools that have been uncovered by archaeologists, although probably the use of stone goes back much earlier than that, but it's harder to recognize when it's less modified. And it ends around 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the Holocene, the beginning of agriculture, and so on. And we tend to divide it into 3 periods, the Lower, Middle, and Upper Paleolithic. But it's really that last period there, the Upper Paleolithic, that I'm going to focus on. So in mixed seminars like this, I'm always the first person to talk because chronologically, but in my time period when I'm at a conference on the Paleolithic, I'm always at the very end because I do the very youngest. It's almost like I do historic archaeology for my colleagues who work with Australopithecines. So just to show you, we have evidence for the earliest human ancestors going back 6, 7, 8, almost 8 million years. And then we have the first stone tools at about 3.5. We have the first evidence of fire about 1 million years ago, but it's not in regular use until about 500,000 years ago. And then we have the art that we're going to talk about right at the very end of this period. Okay, and so then just by comparison, if we think about it, again, to put this in a chronological context, the pyramids of Egypt are only about 4,500 years old. So the art I'm going to talk about is 10 times as old as the pyramids. Writing around 5,300 years old, and then agriculture roughly 10,000 years ago, or 10,000 years old. So the art, again, that I'm talking about today is 4 times as old as the origins of agriculture. Okay, so who were the people that were making the art that we're going to look at today? Well, first of all, these are anatomically modern humans. So these individuals were exactly like us in terms of their biology. We could have mated with them and had fertile offspring. We could have had kids with them, in other words. So they were us. And we often, as archaeologists, make a distinction between anatomically and culturally modern. But for me, I think these people were also culturally modern. They didn't have the same technologies, but in every other way, they were us. And so just living in a different time period. And they lived in groups, small groups of 20 to 30 people. They were nomadic most of the time, so they're changing where they're living with the seasons. They're following the animals. They're following the resources that are available. Although in some places, probably in Central and Eastern Europe, they were a bit more sedentary, so they stayed in place for longer periods of time. The lifespan increased by about 20% in this time period over Neanderthals. So Neanderthals were probably living around 40 years of age, a little bit older. But these individuals were probably living into their 60s. And we don't think about that because I also study Ice Age children. That's my other hat. And people say, well, what's a child when people died at 20? Like, they didn't die. They didn't die at 20, or that's not the average anyways. So people were living fairly healthy lives, actually. And I can talk more about that. But it wasn't really until the advent of agriculture where health starts to decline pretty significantly for a bit. They lived in caves and rock shelters and open-air sites in huts and tents, so they would often use things like mammoth bones, the scapula, for example, and pelvis and so on as sort of the frame for their homes, and they would cover it with animal skins or sod or something like that, depending where in the world they're living. And in some of the rock shelters in France, we'll see that they've carved these little hooks into the front, at least of some of the rock shelters, where we think they were hanging, putting rods and hanging essentially curtains, but used with animal skins or hides, I should say, to either keep the warmth in or to keep the sun out, depending in the time of year. So they're modifying their spaces. And they lived during a series of glacial and interglacial periods. And there's a great book on the climate of this time period called The Age of Chaos. And that gives you the sense of how the climate was shifting, that people would have even noticed over generations. And then they hunted mammoths and reindeer and other large herbivores, but they also gathered plants. And there's a great specialty, which if I could do it all again, I think I would do this. There are people who study the dental calculus, the plaque on your teeth that the dentist removes, and can look at that to see the kinds of plants that people were eating, and so they can get information about that. And we know about people's knowledge of plants for medicinal purposes and so on. And they also had extensive trade networks, so that we see that mammoth ivory, for example, is moving from parts of Europe to parts where there are mammoths to parts where there aren't, and people are using that mammoth ivory, and we're going to hear more about mammoth ivory today, to make their art and their tools and so on. And then shells are moving from the coast inland and so on. And so we don't only have a movement of goods, but we also have a movement of ideas and, of course, people, and for social networks and so on. And a lot of what I've written about in terms of why Neanderthals, for example, went extinct is, I think, because they didn't have that extensive social network that modern humans in the Upper Paleolithic did. I think that is really key when we talk about it taking a village to raise a child, for example. I think that is such an important aspect here, that we have these people who are connected to other groups for that social support. Okay, and so I also wanted to say that these people are actually more complex in terms of technologies, in terms of communities of practice, than we often think. So ceramics, we used to think, came about with the origins of agriculture, but in fact, it's so much older. It's at least 15,000 years older. It goes back to the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, or the middle of the Upper Paleolithic, to 25 to 30,000 years ago, and so we have clay figures. Often they're using a loess, which is kind of like an ashy sediment, ashy clay, and they're firing ceramics. And these are often coming from the Czech Republic, or Czechia, I should say, and Russia and so on, and where we have those more sedentary types of settlements. So we have the very famous Dolní Vesnici figurine that has a fingerprint in the back of the maker, and it's thought to be an adolescent. And this is one of my favorite pieces because not only does she have the most fabulous belly button, and I don't know why, but they often depict the belly buttons on these figurines. But she also, you can see that face. She has slits for eyes, and some people suggest that maybe she's wearing a mask. So it's a really enigmatic figure. And then what we also know is that some of the early ceramics, again, they're not making pots, they're not making things to put grain in, they're not doing any of those sorts of things that we normally think about with ceramics. They're actually making figurines and including animal figures like this lion's head here. And I can talk more about this, but my colleague Becky Farbstein and I recently published a paper showing that children are making a lot of these figurines. And then we also have a really well-developed musical tradition there. So probably the beginnings of music were people playing, using their bodies, to tap out rhythms, or their voices for singing, and probably also using perishable materials, like gourds and animal skins for drums. But we also have a large number of flutes that are either made from bone or made from mammoth ivory or from bird bones, because bird bones are hollow, so they're using swans and so on. And these are incredibly sophisticated. To make the ivory ones, for example, if you can think about taking a mammoth tusk, cutting it, straightening it, splitting it in half, scooping it out, and then so they can be hollow, and then fitting it back together, we know that they actually put little lines to guide them for refitting the two halves of the flute. And they also, when they're putting their the holes in there, they're also putting little places for your fingers to rest. So these are really incredibly sophisticated pieces. And so when a long time ago I was invited to an Archaeology of Music conference, and I was the only, unfortunately, I'm not a musician, but most of the people at this conference were, and it took place in Germany in a monastery in the middle of nowhere. And during the day, we would give our academic papers, and at night, they would put candles all down the row, along the rows of the monastery. And so it was just lit by candlelight, and people would do these concerts based on the academic research they were engaged in. And so one of the very first ones, of course, was a Paleolithic concert that a colleague of mine performed using flakes and blades as sort of chimes. And then he had he'd made a replica of one of the flutes, the vulture on the flute here from Istritz in France. And I'm hoping that this will, I'm not sure how to make that play. I can play it on my computer. I have it set. Do you guys mind? It'll take me 2 seconds I have it all set up.
Because I think it is worth staring.
Anyways, so that's just one example, but there are many flutes, right? And I think it's important to hear, because when we look at the images, again, we think about the visual, but we forget about the auditory. And so the experience of these images, especially if you have ever had the opportunity to go through one of these caves and you hear the water dripping, and you feel sort of the humidity of the cave and the ground and the uneven ground under your feet and all of that. And you can think about looking at these images by flickering light. I'm going to talk more about light in a second. And to think about people playing the music in there is just, anyways, it's amazing. And so there's and people have done so much research on the different sounds that the different flutes make and so on. Here. And so then we also have a rich textile industry, and we know this because we have found spun-dyed flax, for example, from the Republic of Georgia, in beautiful colors like black and gray and turquoise and pink. And again, that expands that range of the color palette that we think of with cave art. Normally, we just think about the ochres and so on, but we know that they're actually using them different colors for textiles, and also for some of the sculptures we've found traces of cobalt and so on them. And then we have imprints of loom woven textiles on fired clay. So when people were making clay, they were sitting in wet clay or kneeling in it. And then we have knee imprints, or basically bum imprints, as people are working on the clay that gets accidentally fired. We have needles, and and then those are the spun-dyed flax there. And so a really rich textile industry. And another paper I did with a former student of mine called "The Best Dressed Hominin" is really goes over all of this. And again, I took the academic point of view on this, and my student, who is an expert in in weaving and all sorts of things like that, in making her own leather out of salmon skin and those kinds of things, brought that whole other dimension to our paper to think about the kinds of choices people have to make in their daily round as they're how do you protect your limited wardrobe and so on. We also have lots of items of personal adornment. This is one of my favorites from Malta and Siberia. This was found in the burial, in a child's burial. And it's made out of mammoth ivory with these double beads. And the pendant there is thought to be an owl in flight. And then at the bottom, we have another sort of necklace from the site of Sangir in Russia. You not only have animal teeth, but you have, again, mammoth ivory beads that have been shaped so that they're interlocking. And then we have elaborate stone tools, again, that go far beyond the function. We have at your left the Magdalenian harpoon. So again, a lot of those decorated like animals. And then we have on the right here a spear thrower, or what we would have called in North America an atlatl, where people put hook that spear onto the end, and it gives them more accuracy and greater distance and so on. But again, there's no reason to have to make a deer, for example, on the back, but they do. Okay, and so when we're talking about Paleolithic art, again, the time period anywhere from around 51,000 actually is the oldest now, to about 12,000 years ago, found all over the world. Beautiful examples coming from Indonesia, and some of the first narrative scenes coming from Indonesia. For example, you have they're sort of these animal-like humans, so half human, half animal hunters. Something interesting is going on there. And we have them from Australia. This is actually what the work I'm doing right now in rock art studies is in a site called Cunalda in southern Australia. I'm not going to talk about it today, but I do have slides with me if anyone's wanting to hear more about this and the narrative context. Next week, when I'm in Australia, I'll be co-chairing a session on storytelling and rock art, and focusing on this. But we have them all over Europe, as far west as the Creswell Craigs in UK, and other ones in Russia, and then filling in the gaps are, for example, rock art from Croatia. But 90% of the rock art that we know of from this time period is found in southwest France and northern Spain. And so looking at the kinds of pigments people are using, again, most of these are local natural minerals, so they're taking them very locally. Or, for example, they're making a fire and using the charcoal from that fire for creating their paints. So they sometimes use the minerals just as crayons. Other times they actually make fairly complex paint recipes that followed a formula, and we can see changes over time. So even if the images stay the same, there's a change in a region in the type of paint recipe that they're making. So that gives us an idea that there are people who are making these decisions together, that we have these communities of practice. So yellow, black, white, brown, blue, green, those are all typical colors that we think of when we think of the art from this period. But as I say, we have blues and greens in the textiles, and some of the figurines have traces of that. And if you ever want to see a great TEDx on ochre, Dr. Tammy Hotchkiss is a friend of mine and the curator of rock art at the Rock Art Museum in Johannesburg, has done a fabulous talk on that. When we think about the themes, though, so the rock art is really, or the art from this period can be divided into parietal art, so art on the cave walls, and also portable art, so objects that can be moved around. But regardless, we see some common themes, things such as carnivores, for example. So we have this very famous panel of lions from Chauvet. But a lot of time, more often, we see herbivores like horses, bison, this beautiful ibex up there, and my personal favorite, the mammoths. And then other more rare ones, for example, fish, not as common, but we do have fish from the fish rock shelter, or Abri de Poisson in France. We have an owl down here, and this one I love because you don't have a lot of owls. You do have owls in portable art, which is interesting, but not very many made on the cave walls themselves, and these ones have been done with someone's finger here. And what's amazing about this is that owls have that ability to turn their heads all the way around. That kind of freaks me out when I think about it. And that's what we have here. If you can see, those are the wings, and its head is like come all the way around. And it's right in between two different galleries, one where you have more red paintings and one where you have more black paintings. So it's like, oh my God. So anyways, it's a little creepy. And then I just thought I'd put a weasel there because you don't see many Paleolithic weasels. So I thought I would and I love saying the word weasels. There you go. And then we also have these portable objects too, which are just absolutely stunning. Actually, there was a show or an exhibit at the British Museum a few years ago on Paleolithic art, and they brought together a lot of these pieces. But you can visit them if you're in Tübingen in Germany. Many of them are on display right there. We also have humans as well. They're very rare. They're less than 10% of the imagery has to do with humans, and most of the humans are found in portable art as opposed to being drawn or painted or engraved on cave walls. So you have the handprints, which we were talking about yesterday, and then of course that figurine again. And here's another example, some more schematized females. And why I love this one, so it's supposed to be women without heads, but breasts and buttocks there. But what I love about this one is that in addition to the 4 adults, we have a tiny one here. So some people think this might actually be a little girl, might be a child. And there are lines connecting this one to the back of that female. So maybe she's in a little back carrier. So. And then we have all sorts of composite images, these humanoids. So everything, including the mask from Altamira, which is also really interesting. They've just taken a natural rock face, or shape, I should say, and used charcoal or manganese to draw eyes to give the sense. And I was telling my students, none of them remember these, but the old days when you had those movies about haunted houses where the paintings and the eyes would follow you. Now with Harry Potter, the paintings talk to you and everything, but back in the day, and that's what this always reminds me of, is apparently, I haven't been to Altamira, but a colleague of mine has, and he said that the eyes seem to follow you wherever you go. And then we have the unicorn, the very famous unicorn from Lascaux. It's a fantastical creature, something that doesn't exist in real life. I always wonder why it's called the unicorn when it has two horns, but that doesn't seem to bother anybody. But it's a really enigmatic figure. And then we have another example here from Germany of the so-called lion man or lion person, who's part feline and part human. So again, a fantastical creature, and I can talk more about those later. And then finally, I just wanted to very briefly talk about protographic communication. So one of my former students and I developed a typology of these geometric signs that we find throughout caves. They don't get as much attention as the animals because they're just not as visually exciting. But we have a whole variety of different signs. We don't know what they mean. So, when people say, if anyone says to you they know what it means, we really don't. But we're in the process of looking for patterning that will hopefully help us to understand them. I have a new graduate student right now who's working on looking at this from a linguistics point of view, and we find them on portable art. We find them on the cave walls as well. This is called a tectiform. Some people think it means that it's supposed to be a tent or a shelter or something like that. We really don't know. But one of them at the site of Rufignac in southwest France, we have one made by an adult and one that looks like it's made by a child side by side. So maybe they're learning how to produce these signs. And in Spain in particular, we have some caves where there's nothing but signs. So they're absolutely, again, amazing. And what we can say is what we have been doing is looking at how they change over time and space. So we know they're not random. Even things like dots and zigzags and so on, which you think would be everywhere, they're really not. There is like a patterning to when they appear and disappear. So the question that James asked me is it art? I don't know. And I actually emailed you. I don't know if you saw this. I said, what's your definition of art? And there was like silence. So I don't know. I guess what I could say is it really depends on how you're defining art. And at the very least, if we think it's, simply just for pleasure or something like that, that's probably not the case. But I spend, a lot of time thinking about whether or not art is the appropriate term for when we're talking about these images from the Paleolithic. I just wanted to contrast that. This is the very famous Banksy, cave art and the council worker. And one of my master's students took this photo for me of someone in Victoria on Dallas Road doing exactly the same thing of spraying over it. And I was like, oh, that's fabulous. I mean, this is a tragedy, but it's, that he's spraying over it, but a fabulous picture to be able to contrast and kind of question what we think of as art even in the modern day. So the questions that we as Paleolithic archaeologists often ask ourselves is, is the term art appropriate? Is art a universal? So is there anything universal about visual perception and our emotional response to art? And I was having some great conversations last night with people who study aesthetics, so we may come back to that in the questions and answers. I'll leave that for a little later. But for me, I tend to look at the biological underpinnings. So I take more of a like a biological science understanding of that. So when I'm looking at universals, but the emotional response to it, I think. And reproducing and creating this art and so on, I think we have to learn to see as others in our group do. And so I think there really is a strong cultural component to all of this. But again, I'm happy to talk about that more during question and answer. But the implications then are, if there are no universals, or if there are few universals, if cultural relativism is so important in all of this, what does that mean for the archaeologists studying Paleolithic art? In practical terms, it means we kind of ignore the question. We kind of say, I don't know whether it's art or not. And there was a very famous symposium and book called Beyond Art, where people were trying in our field to move away from that question, that it was leading to these false endpoints. And so moving away from meaning, and to really look at when the question of art or these images as being meaningful. So why was the making of marks in some places at some times meaningful to some people in the past? And so not to be so concerned of what is this a bison, what does it symbolize or whatever, but to really move away from that and to really bring the science of forensics into the study of art in this time period. So we're looking at who's making the art, how are they making it, and so on, is really where we've decided to, or where the field has gone, I suppose. And so then, is there a ritual context to this art, which was the other question I was asked to think about, or sacred nature to it? Well, we know that these caves are not where people are living for the most part, and it's very unusual to find a burial in there. So they're coming into these spaces for different reasons. For me, I'm really interested in the idea of visual play in the use of light and shadow and so on, and sort of the embodied experience of being in these caves. And so that's really been a shift in our field, where people are looking at soundscapes and looking at using virtual reality to understand how people experience this art. So just very quickly then, this is an example from Chauvet Cave. It's an animal of some sort where we have dots. People often can make dots by using their hands, dipping them in ochre, like an ochre paste, and pressing it on the cave wall. And when colleagues of mine looked at these more carefully, what they realized is that it wasn't just the palms, but you also had the fingers in some cases reproduced as well. And what they realized is that there were multiple hands that were involved in the production of this image. So was it through ritual? Was it, through when people are singing or dancing or doing whatever? And there's one person who has a little curved pinky finger, and they were able to follow that person's hand throughout the cave. And then this is another way of applying paint, is actually to do something called spit painting. And I don't know if you've ever heard this, but if you Google on Michel Lorblanchet, he sounds just like a machine gun as he's applying this paint. So basically, he's studied with Australian Aboriginal painters to learn this technique. Basically, you take some pigment in your mouth, you mix it with your saliva, and you blow it onto or spit it onto the cave wall. And this is a very famous painting from the site of Peshmerel in France, where the whole thing has been done by applying the paint through the mouth. And he replicated this in about 25, 30 hours. And he figured that it probably took someone about 5 to 6 hours to make this, 5 or 6 hours a day for 5 or 6 days approximately to make it, because after about 5 hours of spitting paint onto a cave wall, you're a little, especially because this is done with manganese and there's a bit of a toxicity to that. So I have my students try this in our labs at UVic. We use charcoal. We don't use the manganese. And it's amazing. Some students, there's just more spit than paint on the wall, but others they just have this knack, and they're able to make recognizable handprints and so on almost immediately, and they all leave with charcoal all over their faces and drip down their shirts. And I facilitate it. I'm like, I'll supervise, but they love this. And so it gives us, and so when you talk to Laure Blanchet, he says for him, what's so exciting about doing this is that he feels like it's the breath, that this is like the essential part of the human body and spirit, if you will, being transmitted into the art itself. And then they also use, so the artists back then, if I can use that term, often use the natural topography of the cave walls. So in Altamira, you have these animals here where they're using the natural convexities of the wall to give them a sense of volume. Other times, concavities, little holes, are used as eyes. We have this ibex here. This is one of my favorites from a site called Grotte Cugnac in southwest France. You can go and visit that one. And they're using the natural flowstone to give a sense of the shagginess of the animal's coat. And so for some people, this might tell you, some people have talked about this in terms of shamanism or something like that, which I'm happy to talk to more during questions and answers. But for me, anyways, I think about it as metaphorical thinking, the ability to sort of see in the art itself this animal and to bring it out. Just to kind of come back to here very quickly, as you can see, this shape of the wall here is actually, it looks very much like a horse's head. Now they've actually painted a super tiny head here, but the head that actually fits the body of the horse is that natural rock panel. Sorry, I'll just move on. And so then all of this really has made me very interested in the use of light and movement. And so we know that people were on occasion, making fires in some of these caves. It's pretty rare, but they do. At Chauvet, for example. Other times they're bringing in torches, and we can see the wipes from the torches. In our cave where I work in southern Australia, we have the remnants of their torches there. And they also use these stone lamps, so these fat-burning lamps. And they often use juniper as a wick because it burns like a white smoke, so it's easier to see. And we find these in Lascaux and other places, and often they're in pairs, and they're overturned in pairs at different junctures in a cave, so kind of where you have to make a change in direction. And so if there's two together, it suggests to us that there maybe people were going in pairs or in groups of three. And I'm really interested in how people moved through these spaces holding these oil or fat-burning lamps. And then people have done work with virtual reality to think about how the flickering light would change how we see these images, and we have to remember that we're just looking at them with these flickering lights. And people talk about it as a prehistoric cinema in a way that you have these fading in and fading out, and so on. And then just really quickly, here is an example of an 8-legged bison from Chauvet. And so we don't think that this is several bison being depicted. We do have examples of perspective and occlusion where you have a herd of animals. But here, this is one animal with 8 legs. And when you move your light just the right way, different legs are apparent at different times, and it gives a sense of movement. So again, prehistoric cinema in a way. And you can look up the work of Marc Azema. He has film of exactly what this would look like. And I saw this firsthand when I was in Portugal a couple of years ago. This was the only cave art site I've been to where they're just fine with you taking photos, and so this is the only outdoor rock art site from my time period in Europe. And we took a moonlight tour to see this because during the day the engravings are washed out, but at nighttime, just by the moonlight and a little flashlight held just the right way, you could see these images amazingly. And what I wanted to show you here is this 3-headed horse from the Coa Valley in Portugal. You have the horse's body here, but you have 3 different heads. So you have the body, the neck or the back of the head here of the horse, its ears and the muzzle and so on, and then underneath, and it connects back up to the body. The second horse's head is looking straight here and then down. So again, the muzzle and then back towards the body. And then the third one is really looking down here, again, connected directly from the body, its ears, muzzle, underneath the mandible here, or jaw, and back to the body. So what you have is one horse raising and lowering its head. And so to me, that's amazing. To give another, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to say very quickly one other example. In a cave in Spain, I was taking just a regular tour, and our tour guide showed us, I can't remember if it was a horse or a bison. I'm just going to say a horse for this purpose. But it was just the lower body of the horse. And it was interesting and so on. And we finished the tour. We came back and he said, "Oh, do you remember that horse's body I showed you?" And then he made us step back a little bit. And there was a rock that had the shape of a horse's head. And he just used his flashlight just the right way. And it projected that shadow onto the horse's body. So again, this idea of visual play, I think, is just, for me, what's most extraordinary about the art. So then just to conclude, we're talking about fully modern humans living during a period of climactic insecurity. But what we can see is that they were not primitive in any sense, that they had a rich material culture and a real knowledge of materials. They knew how to use the pigments and the engraving, and how to engrave and use light and shadow and so on in a way that I think, again, is just so extraordinary. So they had this materiality, this knowledge of materials, but they also lived, I think, very rich symbolic lives. Is it art? It's really hard to say, but I'm not sure from my perspective as an archaeologist whether that matters so much in terms of the larger questions that I'm interested in, or at least how I approach my study of it. Is it ritual? Or is there a notion of the sacred with it? Well, probably there was some element of that when we think about the location of the art. Often it's deep in the caves, although probably some of the stuff closer to the entrance has maybe been eroded away. We've talked about that embodied production, about putting your breath into the art. And colleagues of mine have been able to reconstruct whole panels and look at what lines were drawn first and how people moved through that space. And then, of course, it's this multi-sensorial experience. It's the tactile, it's the visual, it's the auditory, and so on. And maybe the scent, right, of the fires and everything. And so, but as an archaeologist studying this, we're really moving away from the search of specific meanings and functions of the art to looking, and bringing forensic approaches in that are bringing us closer to understanding who, how, and maybe eventually even the why of Paleolithic art. And this is really helping us to understand the art on their terms. So why the making of these marks was meaningful to these people at certain times and certain places. Thank you. And we don't want to see that.
I've heard about it. There's a cave in Spain where the staff preps there that they found that there was wear in them, and there seem to be rocks on the ground, so they seem to be doing percussion music.
Absolutely,
in that
yeah.
environment. I don't know if you know or could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's another aspect of the musical tradition there, is that we do see there's actually several caves like that. So in Spain and also in France, where they're using the cave itself becomes an instrument. So we can think about it as sort of a lithophone in that sense. So the stalactites are being, so the ones that, and I guess the stalagmites as well, they're using them, they're hitting them with some kind of mallet, so we can see the percussion mark. But we can also see in cases, especially the one in Spain, has what's the word I'm looking for? Those cave signs that I was showing before, they are also painted in the folds. So again, those are really, again, it tells us that this is very intentional, that this was I think, a very special space. The one where the flute from Easterreeds came from, there's not a lot of cave paintings in that one. I think there's maybe something that might be a wolverine, for example, but so many of our flutes have come from that site. And again, they have that kind of that lithophone in there as well, and the sound in that, the acoustics. Sorry, that's the word I couldn't think of. The acoustics in that cave are just phenomenal. And in fact, that's we tend to, again, when I'm saying the multisensorial, we tend to forget that the site where the spotted horse was, where Laure Blanchet is spinning paint onto the cave walls. I went through there one time with a guide, and she said, do you mind? She stopped, she said, do you mind if I sing? And we're like, it's your cave, And I didn't expect her to have this operatic voice, so this soprano, and she just sang, and oh my God, I'm getting goosebumps actually thinking about it right now. It was the most beautiful sound. So, and it just reverberated everywhere, and you not only felt it bouncing off the walls, but you also felt it right in your body, and so I think when we talk about the musical traditions, the caves themselves are very much a part of that. So
you could also say though that the modern principle is really possible the imitation of prayer, and because one problem of musical instruments is that the room that they're in is implied by the instrument itself, when the instrument is constructed, and so you can't actually separate the strings that well from the environment for player. So what you're saying actually kind of applies to tradition and having a constructed sprayer that sounds to expect from me. If you comprise beating this company very old, but it's what it sounds.
Absolutely. There was someone, forgetting his last name, first name is Igor. A colleague of mine who did a study in some caves in France where he sang in them, and he had a very low voice, and he looked at the relationship between where the paintings are painted and where the acoustics are the best, and he did find a correlation. I wouldn't say that because it doesn't explain all the art and all the caves. People usually want one explanation to explain everything, and that's really not the case at all. But in these some caves, that might have been a consideration, and might explain why some perfect panels that look like they're just begging for art to be made on them aren't utilized. So I think the sound and the space and the imagery really do often, anyways, go together for sure. And ancient, way back in time.
Yeah, Sarah and then Engelberg.
Hi. This makes me want to go back and study archaeology. It's fascinating.
Come with me.
Just circling back to the question of the status of these artists, or whether or not they would be considered artists. I was listening recently to CBC's Ideas, and they were going through a sort of two-part history of neurodiversity and talking about kind of brilliant minds throughout history, like Albert Einstein or Leonardo da Vinci, having kind of neurodiverse minds.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and they were also talking about maybe in Paleolithic time that those the artists would have been considered quite special, and so they wouldn't have to partake in the hunts or those kind of daily activities. I don't know if this has come up in your research at all, but I do wonder about who, if they would have special status or if they would be considered artists during that time.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. So we don't really know is the answer. And so when people say that this is the way it would have worked, we don't know that. We don't have any evidence for that specifically. But there are two things I'll say about that. One is that often, so the images that I showed today are the ones that I think are beautiful or special in some way. And the ones that James chose, I think, are ones that we would, think about from, Jansen's History of Art or whatever, that we tend to see the same images over and over again, and it gives us maybe the false impression that every one of these pieces is a masterpiece when there's a lot of bad art as well, if I can put it that way. A lot of, I don't even know if that person's mom would have put that up on the Paleolithic fridge, but so I wanted to dispel that idea that these are all master artists in that sense. So there is a range of images, but having said that, we do see, as I say, this idea of communities of practice where people are coming together and I think making decisions. So that when I was talking about the pigments earlier, so there's a site called Nowell in southern France, near the border with Spain, and there are these incredible images. It's called the Salon Noir, so all these black images, and they're similar to ones that are made throughout that valley, and when some of them can be dated indirectly and some can be dated directly depending what they're made out of. And what they found when they dated these images, and they also looked at the pigments that were being used to make them, whereas the style stayed the same for thousands of years, over generations. We could see it around 12 or 13,000 years ago, there was a switch in how they made their paint. So they were adding feldspar, for example, or something like that. And so we know that people were coming together and changing technology, but the story that, or at least the images that they were choosing or the style they were using continued. So I think that's one example, I would say, of a community coming together to make decisions, and that, there was something. It's not necessarily that these people weren't also involved in subsistence or something like that, but that there was some real meaning to the people or group that were making these images. We also see, for example, these things called contours découpés, which are these. They often take a horse, hyoid, and they cut these horses' heads out of them, and they're thin and just stunning. And they're highly standardized, and we find them in a number of different sites. So there is I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a specialization happening, but whether these people were considered more special than the person who could bring down the mammoth, or the person who made the bazillions of mammoth ivory beads that we find that are all standardized and so on, or, so I don't know if they would have had a special status. They may have, but it's hard to know from the archaeology, but we definitely know that that there is like a group of people coming together and making these decisions, and across regions. So, yeah, thanks.
One of the things that really interested me was that the music that you played sounded very harmonious.
Yeah,
which I think, just after reading at least vaguely some of the conversations in modern music, a lot of the discussion goes back to Pythagoras and the structure of, harmony on a piano and the distances between notes. Yeah. And some modernist musicians theorized that, with atonal music or potentially music before Pythagoras, you wouldn't hear that harmony the same way because we were conditioned to hear it. So then hearing something so harmonious, it just made me wonder, has there been any work on the structure of like the distances between those notes?
Yeah, so I'll say just right away that I'm not a musician, and so my comments are going to be fairly limited and uninformed on this, but I can say that there has been a lot of work that's been done on these flutes in terms of how they're made, how long you can play them before they go out of tune, for example. So there's a ton of work on that, on the difference between using mammoth ivory versus the bird bones and so on for those sorts of things, and also the placement for sure. Because again, I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that the sound is, really there's a relation between where the holes are and then where the overall length of the piece and so on. So people have done a lot of work on that, and I can give you some papers to look at. It's not really my area of specialty, but I know that there has been a lot of work done on that. But what I can say is that we don't know for sure what the music would have sounded like. This is just, my colleague Will Pines, his interpretation of, or his composition. But one of the flutes that was found in Germany, they did a big press conference, and for a joke, my this same colleague played the Star Spangled Banner. And so just to show that you could do pretty much anything with this flute. And then, of course, the global headlines the next day were, Ice Age flute plays American anthem, and he was like, like, never again will I do that. So I guess my answer to you is that we don't know exactly what they played, but that gives you a sense of the range that was possible. And certainly a lot of work. Graham Lawson, for example, is a UK archaeologist and specialist in music who's done a lot of work, but also a lot of my German colleagues as well. So, and I can send you more information on that. You're welcome.
2 brief questions. Aim with and one more, and then we can probably move on that. I'm sure it'll be watch.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi. I apologize if this is just a case of me mishearing you as you were talking. But when you're talking about the horse and kind of the 3-dimensionality of it, you also touched on shamanism. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. Well, one of the main ideas for the explanation of the art, like why are they making this art, is shamanism. And so, and it's part of sort of this desire for people to understand, like, what is the art about? What does it mean? And so everything from, was it art for art's sake? Was it hunting magic to be able to, if you ritually kill an animal here, does that ensure success in the real world and so on? And so another explanation that people have put out there is this idea that maybe all the art or much of the art is shamanistic. And this was first proposed by someone named David Lewis Williams, who was working in South Africa and looking at the meaning or the context in which some of that art was being produced amongst living people. And then he teamed up with someone named Jean-Claude, who is a French archaeologist and, rock art specialist, one of the world's most important rock art specialists, and they brought that to the idea of the cave art in Paleolithic art, basically. And so it's this idea that maybe these images were produced during some kind of shamanistic trance, that you would, get into it either by being sensory deprived, being in a dark cave, or dancing, or starving, or any of these sorts of ways, and that the art might be a way of these shamans, these specialists, to be able to communicate between this world and the next, that the walls were seen as this kind of veil through which that you could penetrate. And that I'll just say very quickly, there was so we have, for example, images that seem to emerge out of cracks, or animals that seem to be disappearing into cracks. There are bones that have been shoved into cracks and so on. So some people think this is a way of piercing that veil. I have other colleagues, Paul Bond, who who you mentioned that word shaman to him, and his hair explodes, and he calls them sham maniacs. So he would say, oh, those bones are just for like coat hooks. People are hanging there. I don't know. I guess my feeling on that is this idea that there's one like grand vitalistic explanation for all art at all time. When we're talking about art that ranges from 51,000 to 12,000 and all over, in many different parts of the world, there probably isn't one explanation like shamanism. It may explain some things, but not, to my mind, it would be almost incredible if it was this one explanation for the whole time. Yeah, sorry, you had a follow-up for that? Or?
Okay, yeah.
And I'll shorten my answer. I'm not...
Just one brief follow-up and then read.
Oh, and please state your name.
Sorry, Angel Blue. To follow up, does that tie in like the shamanism to like the class of an artist that you were talking about just earlier with the earlier questions?
Well, I really don't know. So again, I don't know if there was a special class or not, or where, if people, or, there's certainly people who are engaged in this. And we see, lots of evidence of where people are, for example, correcting a line or doing something like that. So there's definitely, like a sense of intentionality, of artistry here in a broad sense. But whether we had specialists, this was an artist / shaman, or whether they were separate things, or whether there were even shamans, we're not 100% sure. We often look to the ethnographic record too. So, people living today in hunter-gatherer societies or forager societies to give us at least some information to be able to build on, to create hypotheses or test hypotheses on. So it's possible. I can't give you a definitive answer that they were one and the same, or that they were definitely shamans, unfortunately. So you're welcome.
So, the usual.
Farzaneh, my question is, you showed a slide which showed in one of the caves, it was a relief sculpture of a salmon, le poisson.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have come across on your travels more of these relief sculptures, because there seem to be three kind of artwork: relief, engraving, relief sculpture, engraving, and pigments. Mm-hmm. If you have seen more of these sculpture reliefs. I have an interest in rock art, and I hadn't seen this before.
Oh, yeah,
Right.
yeah. So they have, they use all different kinds of media. So painting, drawing, engraving, haute relief, bas relief, champ élevé, like all these different things. So that was just one example, but there are many, many examples of that for sure. Yeah.
And the three images of three females that
Yes.
you showed,
Yeah.
to me, they look like poisson, fish. What authority defines that these are females, for example?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. And so, a lot of times when we look at these, I'll try and keep this a brief answer, which I'm not good at. A lot of times, there is a bit of what do you see in this image? And often, so for example, I give a lot of public talks, and I give talks in seniors' homes, for example, and I'll say, well, what do you think this is? This is supposed to be something very rare from the site of Cosquer. This is a cave in Marseille. And they'll give me all different ideas, and I'll say, well, actually, the archaeologists think these are jellyfish. And they'll say, come on. They don't care. They're 90. They don't care. They will just tell me they think I'm completely wrong or whatever. And so there is some of that in there. But when it comes, so there is some of what do you see in this? But at the same time, when we're looking at the different categories of humans, there are ones that are those definite humans. There's no question all of us in this room would say absolutely. There are those composite or terianthropic ones that are half human, half animal, or these fantastical creatures. We'd probably all agree on that. And then there's the ones in the middle that are kind of what we call those humanoids. And we think they're human. Mostly they get defined, and this is the work of my colleague Paul Bond that I mentioned a minute ago, they're mostly defined by what they don't have. So they don't have a tail. They don't have horns. So we don't think they're animals. And so it's in some ways it's by default they're human. But to me, I mean, I don't know. I guess if I can go back really quickly to that image. Oh, whoops. There we go. I mean, I guess I've looked at them so much as humans that they seem like humans to me. They don't have heads, but these are considered to be breasts here, and as I say, the buttocks here. And they seem, and they're more, so they're kind of these what we would think of as stylized humans. But I don't know. I mean, you may see something else in them. For me, that's what they look like. But again, it may be because of my academic training that this is where I'm seeing it. They also look very similar to one of the cave signs, and so some people have suggested that maybe one of the cave signs are referring to these images, which are referring to females. But again, I'll leave that out there for you to decide. You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Today we're